see the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.
Hi, it's Edwin Rutsch, and this is Dialogues on How to Build a Culture of Empathy. And today I'm here with Russell Kolts. Thanks for joining me, Russell.
Thanks for having me, Ed.
So I just wanted to give a little introduction about you. You're a professor at Eastern Washington University in the psychology department, and you host a website called compassionatemind.net, which is the online hub for the Inland Northwest Compassion Mind Center. And it seems to be focused around compassion-focused therapy, and you're doing trainings and workshops through it, I believe. And also you have a Facebook page, which is a CFT for anger.
Yeah, yeah.
So is that kind of a basic? Is there more by way of introduction about you that you'd like to share?
Not terribly much. Both the web page and the Facebook page really started as resources to try and support people who were using my book, The Compassionate Mind Guide to Managing Your Anger, which is a compassion-focused therapy application to working with anger. And so I really wanted to put some resources online to support people who are doing that. So the website actually started as just a way to host guided meditations for the exercises in the book, and it's growing slowly from there. So that's pretty much what that's about.
Okay, well, I'm on your Facebook page, and I see a photo. Your image there is you have an image of the book, as well as calm water and some rocks kind of stacked up on each other. What's the significance of that photo?
Well, I wanted something that would be relatively soothing. One of the things in compassion-focused therapy that's really important is helping people to work with their emotions. And what we find is that people have very sensitive threat systems. And so we're very quick to respond with anger or fear or things like this if we perceive threats to us. And one of the things we want to help people do is to work with other emotion systems in their brains and bodies to help themselves feel safe and to balance their emotions, because when we do that, we can think about things a lot more clearly. Our attention broadens. We have more cognitive flexibility. So I really think that when you're doing this sort of work, the medium and the method needs to match the message. So in putting that stuff on there, I'm trying to create a context in which people can have and create the sort of emotional experience that in some ways we train them to create in themselves with compassion-focused therapy.
So it's that sense of calmness, and the rocks are very balancing. So it's kind of like a balancing and calmness kind of feel.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of a classic image. I mean, the stacked rocks in the water, you see that all over the place. And I think it's the imagery is pretty consistent. People use it in similar ways.
And I'm showing your book on Amazon, Managing Your Anger, and you have a leaf there on it's a red leaf and kind of on a wooden background. What's kind of the significance of that?
Well, the publishers are the ones that pick out the covers. But I have to say, I was thrilled. I was thrilled by this when they produced the leaf in the wood. For me, if I was attached significance to it, there's some data that's come out that I think shows that experiences with nature are really powerful and really soothing for us and are very healthy. I think there was one study that showed that folks who lived in urban environments like New York City had lower rates of depression if they had the view of a tree from their office window. So for me, I wanted something. I liked that inclusion of nature and those elements. So I think that kind of, again, fits with the overall theme. There are a lot of anger books, and certainly I'd never critique how anyone else chooses to do their books, but there are lots of anger books with, people making these really angry faces and things like that. And I didn't want something like that, because that's not really what compassion-focused therapy is about. Compassion-focused therapy is about working with those threat emotions and working to replace them with compassionate responses, both in our minds and reflected in our behavior. And I thought the publishers did a real good job of picking a cover that reflected that. So I was real happy with it. But I can't claim responsibility for that.
Okay, it wasn't Yeah, yeah, it is a nice photo. I like that. It looks very woody, kind of old wood look. I like it. And so in these dialogues, I've been starting to do is ask people about their values. Just to kind of get a kind of a little background about each person. And so I'm
Yeah.
wondering, what would you say is your most important personal value to you?
For me, my most important personal value would be compassion and related to that, connectedness, valuing a sense of connectedness with others and a sense of interdependence.
Mm.
So, this sense that we're all human beings, we're all born into difficult lives, even those of us who have relatively privileged lives without, born into families that love us with sufficient, not a lot of poverty, not a lot of, into abusive experiences, but have relatively good lives. We all get sick, we all die, we all lose people we love, we all go through these difficulties. And so compassion, I think, would be it for me.
Mm-hmm. So it's that sense of compassion and connection with
Yeah,
others,
yeah.
and how did that become important to you? Do you have some kind of a story or anecdote of how through your life that became an important value to you?
You know, Gosh, I don't know. I think that I was fortunate enough to have received a fair bit of that. Um, I don't remember this, but the earliest story of me, I remember my great grandmother wrote an autobiography, and someone said, "Hey, you should look at this because you're in there." And I barely knew her. She passed away when I was maybe 4, 5. Um, but there's a story. Apparently, I was holding my hands like this. There was a spider that was crawling all over me.
Mhm.
And my grandma said, well, squish it, Russell, squish it. I didn't. I just kept watching it crawl all over me. And she kept telling me to squish it. And I finally said, well, why, Grandma? Why should I squish it? And she said, well, because it's crawling all over you. And apparently, of course, I don't remember this. Apparently, I said something to the effect of, well, that's all it can do. So apparently even, I think I just, my sense is that probably I had received a little compassion, and there was this sense that, I don't know if that's empathy or compassion or what, but certainly it's what drew me into psychology. And like everybody else, I had some real struggles growing up with different things. And I have some memories in my life of friends just taking a moment to show me kindness and compassion when I was really struggling. And, some of those memories still stand out for me. So,
Do you want to recount one of those memories? Is there one that kind of stands out for you?
no, no, nothing archetypal,
Uh-huh.
nothing like this was the memory.
Uh-huh.
Mostly, I remember a time when I was just feeling, really down. I was at school one day and I was feeling really down. And, probably like most early adolescents, you go through a phase where you feel like, well, nobody likes me. I'm on the outside sort of looking in. I think it's pretty common. And I remember kind of feeling like that. And just having a classmate, I remember her name was Amy, just come up and say, hey, you look like you're pretty down, or, are you okay? What's going on? And, it wasn't a big thing in terms of anything going on in my life, but 30 years later, I remember it.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, it's just
So,
one person kind of reaching out and connecting to you
yeah.
there. And yeah, it leaves a memory in our body.
Well, and I think that's really important, Edwin, when you're thinking about compassion and empathy. I think a lot of times we tend to think about these things in terms of grand gestures. But here it is 30 years later, and I don't remember the grand gestures. I remember the friend who walked across the room and just asked how I was doing. Those are the things that we don't even maybe anticipate that, but those are the things that can have profound impacts on people's lives. And we've got opportunities to do that, you know, dozens of times per day if we think about it, if we make the space in our lives to do that.
Well, okay, you're saying that connection and compassion are your most important values. And so we're kind of wanting to explore how we can build a culture of empathy and compassion. And I'm really excited about, kind of connecting that to kind of anger and how anger works, because it looks like you've really looked into that
Yeah.
deeply. But before we do that, perhaps we can look a little bit at definitions. How, because I've been looking at empathy for some time now, and there's a lot of different ways that the word is defined, and even empathy and compassion have seem to be
Yeah,
different
yeah. People
definitions.
talk about them very differently.
So I'm just wondering, kind of what is your basic definition of empathy and compassion?
Well, with empathy, I would define empathy is cultivating an understanding of what another person is feeling. And or maybe not cultivating, but just understanding what another person is feeling. I part ways with some definitions because I think there are some definitions that are purely emotional. Sometimes when people talk about empathy, they say it's feeling what another person is feeling. And from my perspective, I think in some ways that's sort of impossible. I think we can work to understand what another person's feeling, but I think, to actually feel exactly what they're feeling is probably impossible because we have these mirror neurons. So we do get those echoes. We do get the sensations, but our experience of reality at any given moment is always influenced both by the information that's coming in from the outside and all that previous conditioning we've had, all the information that's coming down from our implicit memory of all the other situations we've had in our lives. And so that emotional experience we're having is going to be drawing upon both of those bits of information, what the other person's feeling and emoting, and the connections we're forming or that we formed previously, that implicit learning and implicit memory. So we shouldn't assume that we're feeling what they're feeling. I think so that's part of it. But I think to really understand what someone else is feeling, I think it requires some cognitive work as well to think about, well, what's going on in their mind? How are they making sense of this? How does this make sense? And some people might think that goes beyond the strict sense of empathy. But I think empathy for me is about understanding what another person is feeling, not just feeling it. So I don't know if that is clear or not.
For me, it's very clear because I think about this all the time. Yeah. So it's like there's the basic emotional component of it, you're saying, and that's kind of through the mirror neurons. But there's also a sense of what's going on, the kind of the stories and experiences that we're bringing to it. So we're never totally feeling what the other person feels.
Yeah,
in 100%.
Yeah, so I think to really get what they're feeling, I think with empathy, it requires some consideration of, well, how would this feel for them, given what I know about them, given that they're different from me? So if I'm talking with an African-American female, for example, this person has an entire range of experience that I can never fully understand. So I can think about that and I can consider that in trying to understand how she's feeling. And of course, the best way to do it is to check it out with her and say, well, I feel like this is kind of what I'm getting. Is that right? Help me understand what you're feeling. Mm-hmm. I think we have a hard time doing that sometimes, but I think that's the best way to check it out and say, what are you feeling? Is it kind of like this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's that kind of reflective listening seems to be very effective in terms of hearing what someone is saying, then reflecting back and asking for confirmation. And then I'll do that sometimes, and they'll say, "That's not quite it. This is how it is." And then I'll reflect back on that and say, "Yeah, that's it." So.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely right. And, as therapists, we may think about that as that's for the client. That's our communication of empathy, so they know we're getting it. But, what you just said reflected it perfectly. It's every bit as much for us to make sure we actually are understanding it and are getting it and making sure that our experience of what they're feeling isn't overly colored by our own conditioning and history and background and all those things, right?
Yeah. And then the other part was the compassion component. So you're saying that empathy has those two components, the kind of through mirror neurons, feeling someone else, and then there's a cognitive component, kind of the perspective taking, seeing someone else's perspective, and kind of bringing that into it, and then kind of the relationship to compassion.
Yeah, so I would say, again, empathy I consider as understanding what another person is feeling. For me, compassion, people define compassion in lots of different ways, but I tend to stick with the version that is consistent from the dictionary to the Dalai Lama, which is a sensitivity to suffering and with accompanying motivation to help alleviate it. And so actually my favorite definition, I like to say compassion is being moved by suffering and being motivated to alleviate it. And I like that term moved because it implies sort of an emotional connectiveness. There's sort of a sympathy sort of implicit in that. So that's my favorite way of saying it. But I think there's, again, two components: sensitivity combined with a motivation to alleviate the suffering too.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, yeah, there's like I was saying, I've interviewed a lot of people around empathy and compassion. There's a lot of different definitions, even within the academic world. So I've been kind of working to try to synthesize them, and even interviewed, people like Daniel Batson, who's been working on these definitions for quite some time.
Oh, yeah.
And he says he's kind of articulated like 8 different ways the word is actually used. So, and he says it's just it's like people are using it differently, and it's important that when you start the conversation that you kind of articulate how you're using it and then stick with it.
That's absolutely right. There are so many people. You'll have conversations for 30 minutes and then realize you're talking about 2 different things with the same word, right?
Yeah. So let me just perhaps share how I'm kind of defining it. So for me, empathy is like 4 parts to empathy. The first part is self-empathy. So that's that kind of what you were saying in terms of the baggage, what's going on inside of ourselves, kind of the awareness of self. So sensory awareness, you see that in in mindfulness, where you can you feel what's going on inside yourself. It is a felt experience. So and the second part is mirrored empathy. So that's that mirror neurons, that's kind of, as you're doing a motion, I'm feeling the motion. When we do an action and we see an action, the same neurons fire in our brains. So we have sort of a simulation of feeling what someone else is going through. Then there's the part that you're talking about, which is the perspective taking, which is sometimes called cognitive empathy or perspective taking. I just call it I call it imaginative empathy, because we're kind of imagining like an actor, like what would it be like if I was in your shoes, with your background, and what would it feel like? What would the influences be on me, and how would I act and feel? And then the fourth part is empathic action, which is that as we kind of see our common humanity, we feel each other, we see each other's perspective, we kind of become almost like a third body, a shared common humanity that we feel. And that we're kind of like biologically wired to want to contribute to the well-being of others when we have that deep sense of connection. And I call that empathic action. And for compassion, it seems to be the same process, except it's the slice on pain and suffering. So when we see that pain and suffering is that we're looking at someone else's pain and suffering, and we have self-compassion, mirrored compassion, kind of perspective compassion, and compassionate action. And usually that compassion is with consoling. There's a large part of wanting to console, be present, a deep sense of presence with someone when they're in that suffering. So that's kind of like the framework that I'm using. I'm just wondering how that kind of resonates with you.
That resonates with me. I like that a lot. The way you defined empathy there, particularly with the empathic action, really describes empathy as very much a gateway to compassion. Right? You can't really, and that to me is really reflective of my clinical work. I remember in graduate school, someone said to me, "You don't have to like your clients to help them," and that that didn't sit very well with me at the time. And the more I thought about it, the less well it sat with me, because what I observed in my own clinical work, and I can't say that this is universal, but when I was able to achieve a certain level of empathy with my clients, a level of liking followed. And maybe not liking isn't the word, but that sense of connectedness that you're describing, a feeling of kinship and commitment And, even if they did a lot of stuff I didn't agree with, I find myself having a lot of sympathy for them and wanting the best for them.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, there's something to that. Now, some would say that empathy does not contain an implicit wish to help. I've heard some people say, well, the torturer you don't want to have is the empathic torturer, right? I've heard folks talk about how you can have people can understand one another's emotions, but not have the intention to help. And I think the question is, do you call that empathy, or do you call it something else? Do you call it theory of mind, or something like that?
Yeah, that someone can have that understanding of you and how you're kind of feeling, but not have that sense of connection. And through theory of mind, I think Tanya Singer kind of has some work on that too, kind of as two separate threads, kind of a theory of mind way of understanding someone else.
Yeah. There are some differences there, and I'm certainly not a theory of mind expert, but I've heard people talk about empathy in that, it's not necessarily always kind way, but certainly that's the kind I'm concerned with.
Yeah. Well, I'd really like to explore that in more depth, because that comes up a lot. It's like empathy in the used car salesman. People talk about that, or empathy in the torturer, that you're kind of using empathy as a tool to advance your selfish own interests. And for me, in a sense, that's not really empathy. There's like a split there. It's like you can have some empathy and some selfishness, and or self-interest, or so. But that's something maybe we can go into it at a deeper in other times. I think it's a really great area. The other thing, one other way of looking at empathy and compassion, I find, is through metaphor. So, empathy is actually culturally defined as the metaphor of standing in someone else's shoes and seeing through someone else's eyes. And that kind of comes at the definition from a different kind of angle. And for me, empathy is like a cornucopia, in the sense that when I have that sense of connection that you're talking about, there's this richness. I'm feeling all these different feelings from the other person.
Yeah.
And it feels like it's opening me up to a wide cornucopia of feelings and experiences that I wouldn't have by myself.
Yeah,
and
I like it.
And if I'm the opposite, for me would be in a desert where it's hot, dry. My lips are chapped. I'm alone, and it's the Sahara. Totally monotone.
Yeah.
So that's the opposite. So I was wondering if you have like a metaphor for empathy or compassion. It's kind of like your own metaphor of what they would be like.
Well, if I was thinking about empathy, it would depend on whether or not I was talking about the person who was providing the empathy or receiving it. So for the provider of empathy, I think my metaphor would be like bird watching. I know, it's silly. When I was in graduate school, I was very poor and I was in need of a hobby. So I had this old set of binoculars my grandparents had given me years before, and I actually rolled pennies to buy a field guide for bird watching. I said, I'm going to bird watch. It's just an excuse to get outside, right? But when you go bird watching, there's a particular way you do it. You go out into this natural environment, and you're very quiet. You're interested. You're vigilant. You're watching carefully. You're listening carefully. You're minimizing the amount of noise you're putting out. And so you see a bird, and so you're even more vigilant. You're like, oh, what is this? You're interested, watching, listening. And so it's like you're in the background, and you're entirely focused on this other being, and using sort of all your facilities to try to understand, what is this that I'm seeing? What is this that I'm hearing? And so for me, empathy is sort of like that. It's like when I'm empathic toward another person, the meanness, the part of me that needs to assert, hey, Russell, and he's important and pay attention to him, sort of fades into the background as I'm able to take in this cornucopia you're talking about.
Yeah, that's kind of like the method of getting to the cornucopia, is that bird watching. So you're kind of just watching, being present, kind of focused on the other, and letting their experience kind of come into you.
Yeah, and if you're a loud bird watcher, you're not going to see any birds because you're going to scare them off.
Mm.
And I think it's the same way with empathy. If we can't, if our stuff is always intruding, it's going to be hard for the other people to express what they're feeling, and so we're not going to see it. It's not going to appear, or if it does, we're not going to notice it because we're getting in the way. So this quality of quiet vigilance and really interested, kind of warmly interested.
Yeah.
So that's my metaphor for the person who's giving the empathy.
And for the receiver, do you have a metaphor for that?
I liked your opposite of empathy as a dry desert metaphor, because for me, if I think about the receiver of empathy, I think about things like water for a thirsty person. Right? If you've ever been like really upset about something, I mean, I told you about that experience I had when I was in middle school. If you've ever been really upset and you're really struggling, and someone shows some interest, or you're trying to express what you're feeling, and they say it sort of sounds like you're feeling like this or something like that, and they get it just right.
Mm-hmm.
That feels great, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Yeah.
Oh, it's like, you're dry, you're thirsty, and someone gives you a cool glass of water, and you just immediately, there's this coming down and this feeling of safety and this feeling of comfort. So for me, that would be my metaphor for empathy for the receiver, like a cold glass of water for a thirsty person.
Oh, I love that, because I actually have a story about that. I was in a workshop once where I was trying to convey something to someone, and it's like they weren't kind of getting it. They weren't getting it. Yeah. And it's like I could feel, my body get tenser. It's like and then I said, "Can you just repeat back what it is that I said to you?" And they kind of reflected back what I said, and I could viscerally feel like this flood of emotion kind of go out. And it was like, oh, it feels so good. You really got what I said.
Got it. Yeah, it feels great.
Yeah.
Well, and in terms of motivating ourselves for empathy, I think we need to remind ourselves how powerful that is, that feeling of just feeling understood, And so, because we can give that to other people, and, if we go about it the right way, we can elicit it from other people.
Yeah, that was a lesson to me, that you can actually ask for empathy and just ask for a reflection. It was like, oh, you can really do that?
It's crazy, though, how rarely we just talk about how we're feeling with one another, right?
Yeah.
It's this, but I think it's the quality of vulnerability that goes with it. I think there's this sense of when we really put ourselves out there in a genuine way, there's that threat system in the back of our minds going, are they going to use this to hurt me? Right? If I really make myself vulnerable, is this going to, and so we hesitate, I think.
Vulnerable is kind of like opening up, and that who knows what's going to happen to those delicate feelings.
Yeah, but I was watching this. There's this wonderful YouTube video, this TED Talk with Brené Brown, and I think she was talking about that. I think it may even be called something like the power of vulnerability or something like that. She was talking about how that experience of vulnerability and sharing vulnerability is just like the fount from which so many good things come from.
Well, that, like a fountain, there's another metaphor, right? The fountain of vulnerability. And so you're really good at these metaphors. So I'm going to keep kind of pushing this.
I'm a statistics teacher.
You're a statistic.
So you gotta have something.
At your night, you're a metaphor creator, perhaps. But so what about the metaphor for compassion? How do you see that? Is that different? Or?
Well, for that, it depends. That was terrible. It depends on whether it's not compassion for someone else or compassion for you. If it's self-compassion, my favorite metaphor, one of the things that we try to do in compassion-focused therapy is try to help people cultivate certain aspects of their personality. One of the things we see in folks that really struggle with difficult emotions, we break up the emotions into 3 subsystems. So we talk about emotions that evolve to help us detect and respond to threats, like anger, fear, things like this. And then we talk about emotions that evolve to motivate us to pursue and then reward us for gaining goals, So goals, ambition, sort of lust, those sorts of things that get us pursue the things you want and need to survive, right? And then we talk about the third system is basically the safeness system. So those are the emotions that basically your oxytocin, the mammalian caregiving system, where you're feeling safe, comfortable. A lot of the ways we were talking about when you receive empathy, there's that sense of, I feel okay. Things are okay. I'm not fighting anything off. I'm not chasing after anything, right? So one of the things we try to do is to help people work with those different emotions. And a lot of folks who struggle spend a lot of time operating out of the threat system. So they're experiencing a lot of anger or a lot of fear. And the problem with those emotions, they operate in our minds in very powerful ways. Paul Gilbert talks about this a lot, and I do in my book as well. When we experience emotion, a lot of times we think that emotion is just how we feel. But if we really look at what's going on in our minds when we're angry or when we're scared or when we're aroused, attracted, these different things, when we're motivated to help, different motivations and emotions shape our minds. They organize our minds in really powerful ways. So it's not just how we feel. It's the thought and thinking and reasoning that's going through our mind. It's the way these emotions shape our attention. We could talk about, for example, why those attack ads are so effective in elections. Because the way anger shapes our attention and shapes our thinking and reasoning and things like this, it magnifies the impact of these things. Those emotions create imagery. You know, we tend to produce certain types of imagery when we're under the influence of different emotions. We tend to experience different motivations. We tend to behave in different ways. There's that felt bodily experience as well. So sometimes we have people talk about, for example, having an angry self or a sad self or an anxious self, and to begin to identify what's going on in my mind when each of these selves shows up, right? From the perspective of my anxious self, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I motivated to do? What am I actually doing? What's going on in my body? And so what we're trying to do is help people develop what we call the compassionate self. And the compassionate self has a lot of very specific qualities like empathy and sympathy and the ability to tolerate distress. And the compassionate self reasons in different sorts of ways. So, for example, where the anxious self says, or the angry self, the threat emotions influence in ways, so we tend to be very judgmental and say, well, this is good, this is bad, this is right, this is wrong, I like you, I don't like you. Compassionate thinking and reasoning tends to ask more questions. Like, how does it make sense that this person would act this way, right? What's going on in me right now? I'm feeling really angry. What am I thinking that's fueling this anger that I've been feeling for the last 3 hours and things like this? And so we try to help people develop the compassionate self, these qualities in themselves, and to really identify that as sort of a superordinate aspect of their personality, if you will. So to try and put that aspect of the personality in sort of a position as almost a kind of a benevolent authority. So I can shift into the perspective of my compassionate self to help me work with these difficult emotions. So my metaphor for that is like the captain of a ship. So I want you to imagine that you're out on a boat in a ship in the middle of the ocean, and the seas are very stormy, and it's very scary. Kind of like life gets very stormy and very scary sometimes. Right? And you can imagine these different passengers. Imagine that the angry self and the anxious self and the sad self are on this ship, and they're the passengers. And the angry self is getting angry because that's all he knows how to do. And he's saying, I knew this was stupid. I should have never gotten on this boat to begin with. We're all going to die. Right? And the anxious self is, oh, I'm terrified. We're not going to make it. We're going to die. This is so scary. Right? And curling up in a corner maybe. The sad self is saying, well, it's all over for me. I'm never going to see loved ones again. It was a bad decision, probably my fault. I'm just going to go down to the bunk and lay down and die, right? But the captain of the ship, this compassionate captain of the ship, knows that if you're going to live on a boat, if you're going to be on a ship, sometimes the seas get stormy. And that there are things we can do to deal with that. It's not the end of the world. We can work with the situation. The captain also understands the perspectives of these passengers. The captain gets that these passengers don't know. They're very, very vocal, but they don't have the wisdom or the repertoire to deal with the storm all the time. Right? Angry self only knows how to be angry, and that skill set doesn't fit that well with everything. But this compassionate captain, because he understands that these different selves, they're just doing what they can do. The only thing they know how to do to try to protect me, protect the ship, right? Protect themselves. So he's not going to say, "Oh, shut up, be quiet." He's going to understand. He's going to say, "Oh, I get it. I understand why you're so angry. I get why you're so scared. I understand. Yeah, it makes sense that you're sad, but we can get through this." Right? So there's this quality of understanding the other different aspects of the emotional self, being able to self-soothe, to shift out of those single-minded perspectives of those threat emotions and into a perspective that takes a broader focus of attention, an ability to think flexibly, problem solve, and to ask questions like, what would help me feel safer in this situation? Do I need some support, right, from my friends or maybe from a therapist or something like this? So I really like that captain of the ship metaphor for self-compassion, this sense that we can cultivate this aspect of ourselves that recognizes that life is difficult and there are things we can do to deal with it, and that it's not our fault that we have these difficult emotions. We're all born with brains that produce them, and so there's no sense in beating ourselves up for having them. And in that way, it's sort of similar to Kristen Neff's idea of common humanity, right? This recognition that we all are caught up in this difficult life with these tricky brains, as Paul Gilbert says.
Yeah, so it's I like that metaphor. It's the ship. For me, that ship would be our society, right? In general, it could be a personal society within ourselves or kind of a larger society. And what I'm looking at is how do we create a culture of empathy on that ship, on our personal ship and on our wider societal ship. And,
yeah.
And I mean, I think it's kind of the same thing. You're calling it a compassionate, kind of like a culture of compassion within that, maybe on that ship. So that the compassion is the primary space and culture that we're living in. And on all those other feelings, the fear, the anger, are all there as passengers and part of it. We have to find a way of empathically and compassionately, kind of addressing those.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. That's what we have to do.
Yeah, and then how to do that, you're saying it's kind of like a sense of understanding. It's like the compassion, we need to understand all these different emotions, passengers that are on the ship, the anger and the fear. And
it starts with understanding, but I think, this idea of how do we create a culture of empathy? How do we create a culture of compassion? I think the first thing we have to do is to stop willfully creating a culture that's the opposite. Mm-hmm. I think, one of the things, it's very hard to care about what other people are feeling. It's very hard to have empathy and compassion when people are in a state of threat, when people themselves don't feel safe. It's very hard because, again, at this point, our self-protection systems kicked in and we become concerned about the threat, not about what other people are feeling. And I think, I don't want to speak too controversially, but I think that the way our culture in particular works, we have found that one of the most easy and powerful ways to motivate human behavior is by hitting them in the threat system.
Yeah.
By making them angry, by making them anxious. And of course that works because, those emotions evolved to motivate us to move, to get going, to defend ourselves, to pursue things we want. And so, for example, the elections. Right, we've got a presidential election going on right now, and there are all these attack ads. And people say, well, why all the attack ads? I mean, really, nobody likes them. Why do we do this? Well, we do it because it works. If you look at anger specifically, when people get angry, studies show that some pretty specific things happen in our minds. So anger, first, is associated with a sense of certainty. So notice this, next time you're angry, you'll be having some thoughts. Notice how sure you are of your perspective, right? When we're angry, there's this sense of certainty. And that sense of certainty is sort of independent of what we're angry about. In fact, you could even elicit anger, have people make judgments about something completely unrelated, and then ask the people who are angry and the people who aren't angry, how certain are you of your perspective? And the people who are angry will be more certain, even though the judgment was about something completely unrelated to what they're angry about. Other studies show that when we're angry, we're more likely to rely on stereotypes. We're more likely to kind of blindly accept the words of an authoritative other. We might expect, particularly if that person already kind of is saying something that we kind of generally agree with anyway. So when we're angry, we become very certain, but we process information more superficially. Our attention becomes it's narrowed. This is what threat emotions do. They tend to narrow our attention, narrow our cognitive flexibility. And so it works. If you want to get people to vote against another person, convince them that he or she is going to ruin the country. Right?
Well, the first part you're talking about, we have two different emotions here. One is fear and the other is anger. So you're saying that, and I actually agree with this too, and I see it. I mean, I viscerally feel it within our culture, that it's almost like we're consciously creating a culture of fear. We're doing what we can to generate fear, especially like you're saying through attack ads and whatnot. And so, and using that fear as a motivation tool to get people, to kind of do something.
Yeah, well, and we do that. And, I think it's fair to say that advertisers do this as well. It's less overtly fear-based, but in terms of hitting the threat system or hitting those basic motivational, emotional systems, right? So, I mean, if you're an advertiser and you go and your commercial starts out by saying, your life is perfect just as it is. Are they going to buy your stuff?
Yeah.
Right? There's this sense of, I think, creating a sense of unsettledness helps when you're trying to sell something, because you're saying, okay, here's an unsettled piece of your life, and here's how what I'm selling is going to help with that. Here's how it's going to make it better. They're also, advertisers are really good at getting our drive systems going. I mean, this is why we see beautiful half-naked people being used to sell things like chewing gum, right? Because chewing gum isn't that inherently interesting. But if you can get that arousal system going, right, it makes it much more interesting. And so, again, there's that classical conditioning, that implicit memory. If we can put together gum with this sense of slight, attraction, arousal, suddenly that gum just seems a little bit more interesting than the other gum. So I think that we have this culture that has a lot of these messages that are pushing the anger button and the anxiety button and the you want this button. And I think when those emotions really get going within us, it makes it harder to be empathic.
Yeah,
right?
So it's like, we're wanting, at least for myself, I'm wanting to do the exact opposite in terms of, push the empathy button. It's like have to foster, because we're creating kind of like this culture of fear. And the fear, like you're saying, is when we're afraid, it narrows our focus of attention, and then we have less ability to do the bird watching, right? We're too focused.
Absolutely.
We're too focused on, on kind of the rattlesnake, at the foot, near our foot. We're not focused on the bird anymore. We're focused on this rattlesnake, and are we going to be bitten by this rattlesnake?
That's absolutely right. And, if you watch the political ads and a lot of the politicians, they're saying you will be bitten by the snake.
Mm-hmm.
If this person gets in, if that person, you're going to get bitten by the snake. Right. So you need to follow my cause. And so if we really want to create a culture of empathy and compassion, I think we've got to take responsibility for that. And I think we've got to, I think it starts with the understanding that, what we're doing here, it is, you're right, it's an effective way to motivate behavior, but the cost isn't worth it. It's at the cost of compassion. It's at the cost of empathy. It's at the cost of connections. And so we need to not do this anymore.
Yeah, so you're saying, difficult. Yeah, so the first part is kind of be aware that, hey, this is the dynamics that's playing itself out. If we want to build a culture of empathy and compassion, let's get a sense of how is the what are we doing? What's going on here? So it's a matter of understanding and increasing awareness of kind of how the culture is kind of structured and playing out.
Yeah, if we stop getting in the way of empathy and compassion, there's a lot of reason to believe that you'll see a resurgence of it on its own, because we naturally will tend to do this. We have these mirror neurons. We naturally form connections. We nurture one another. I mean, when, the example I use sometimes, when you say the word, if you have people pause and say, I'm going to say a couple words, and I want you to just pay attention to what you feel when I say this. Hungry child. Something comes up.
Yeah.
Something comes up. For most people, just hearing those words, hungry child, wow. There's a sense of caring that comes up. There's a sense of, gosh, I'd like to do something about that. So, I think there are lots of things we can do to train empathy and to teach people how to engage in empathy and to help them understand why it's worthwhile to develop in compassionate ways. But the biggest thing, I think, is just to get out of the way and stop doing things culturally that actively inhibit it.
Well, there has been something. I mean, I had a kind of one of these peak experiences in a dance that I do like a freestyle dance every week, and I've recounted this story several times, but I'll do it again. Is that I was in the dance, I was dancing around, and I was saying, I have a lot of anxiety within myself. It's that fear and anxiety. I can feel it. I can viscerally feel it, and it felt like kind of like a black spike kind of through the core of my body. And, I'll usually go dance and go do something else and kind of avoid it, or, just get into something else. But I said, I want to really be as present as I can to that fear. I want to get as close as I can. So I brought my awareness and my consciousness to let it fill my body and I wanted to feel, get to the nitty gritty, the grains of it, and feel it, get as close as I can to feel it. And I kind of it was filling my awareness. And then it's almost like that type of fear kind of dissolved and it moved away. But within 3 to 5 seconds, a new fear came, and it had a whole different aesthetic quality to it. In the sense, it was like a heavy weight of a cloud on me that was not black like this spike, but kind of like a foggy cloud that was like a weight. And I did the same thing. So, okay, I'm going to go into this foggy cloud of anxiety and get close to it. And as I did, it dissolved. But it was like within 3 to 5 seconds, it was like another one came up. Yeah. And I kept doing this for like a couple hours, for about an hour in all kinds of different situations, looking for the fear. And I would just try to be present with it, and it would dissolve, and then another one would come up. And for me, and at the end, I felt so blissed out. I mean, I was like it was like every time I transformed one of those fears and dissolved it, I got a little shot of oxytocin or something, a little bit calmer.
Probably a bit of dopamine there too.
And dopamine too. So I felt so calm. So for me, it was like, one way is you're saying is, well, let's understand the overall what's happening. But the other part is it seems that we need to have a sense of presence and bring our presence into the fear and the anxiety and maybe the anger or something. And there's something about that too.
That one of the nice things, the really nice thing that's happened over the last 20, 30 years, and I have this incredible sense of gratitude to people like John Kabat-Zinn, who really brought mindfulness over many years to the forefront of what's going on in psychology in this country and other parts of the world right now. Because what you're really describing there, Edwin, in looking at those fears is mindful awareness and attention to your fear. And, the idea is that we all have these difficult emotions that will come up in us. And, if you look at, a lot of the problems that people have, it's not that they have emotions like fear or sadness or anger or whatever. It's that they have the emotion and they say, oh, that's bad. Mm-hmm. And they engage in avoidance and things like that, which has a lot of unintended consequences. You know, they engage in all these avoidance behaviors. And instead of just facing the fear, just getting to know it. And what happens when we do mindfulness, when we allow ourselves to stay in contact with the emotion, in this case, the fear, we learn not to be scared of our own emotions. You know, I don't know, but I would bet at the end of that hour, if you were walking along and a new fear came up, you could notice the fear, but you wouldn't be particularly discomforted by it. You'd say, oh, look, there's another fear. This is interesting.
Yeah.
Right?
There was some
As
kind
Tara
of
Brach says, this is how it is right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was like my resilience was deepened. You know, I wasn't like on the edge. Like, you know, when your resilience is really low, it's like any kind of a fear can set you off, and you kind of develop this deeper and deeper sense. I call it like an empathy battery, that as we empathize with these fears and anxieties, that it kind of fills, we get more space, or I feel that space within myself.
Yeah, you can allow it and you can understand it without getting lost in it.
Yeah.
Right. And that's the whole, if you look at the mindfulness folks, they have all this, you know, I'm sure you're familiar with the RAIN acronym.
No, I'm not.
Right? It stands with, it refers to mindful awareness. So it's recognize, accept, investigate, and non-identification. So the idea is, we recognize, oh, look, I'm afraid. We accept, okay, I'm experiencing fear. That's just how it is right now. Okay, that's how it is. We investigate, which is exactly what you did. You looked closely. Oh, this feels like a spike. We investigate it, just like we're sitting out there looking for a bird. We're bird watching. We're very vigilant. What is this fear like? What is this? What's going on? What am I feeling? And then that last piece is non-identification. We recognize that fear is an experience I'm having, but I am not the fear, right? That's not me. That's an experience that's passing through my mind right now, that is impermanent, that will come, that will go, and later it'll come again. And what happens is when we can do that, we begin to desensitize to our own emotional experiences. So when they come up, instead of getting all worked up over the fact that we're having the sort of emotional experience that we will commonly have, we just say, oh, you know, this is what it's like right now. This is what I'm feeling. I wonder if there's anything I can do that would be helpful as I deal with this difficult experience I'm having, right? So if I'm getting ready to give a talk, I'm going to do a workshop tomorrow. I've done enough of these that I don't get too anxious about it, but you know, the first few, I'd get really anxious. So if I get anxious before the workshop, there are two ways I can respond to it. I can say, oh, I'm anxious, this is terrible. Or I can say, oh, I'm anxious. Well, of course I'm anxious. I'm doing a workshop tomorrow. I'm going to be speaking in front of a bunch of professionals. It makes complete sense that I would be anxious. Is there anything that would help me here? Oh, well, I can slow down my breathing. And maybe that would take the edge off the physical experience of the anxiety. So that mindful awareness that you described creates space for us to work with the emotional experience rather than getting caught up saying, oh, it's good or it's bad or it's right or wrong or, oh, pushing it away or whatever, you know.
So it's the importance of going to it and being present with it. And so that was like the fear, anxiety. But your work has really been around anger, and I'm wondering how does fear kind of transition to anger, or what's the relationship and the relationship to empathy and compassion to anger?
Well, you know, quite frequently when we're experiencing threat emotions like fear or anger, we'll be experiencing multiple ones at the same time. Right.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, if you notice when you're angry, there's a threat there. There's some underlying anxiety. And so I actually, the first compassion-focused therapy groups I developed and ran, I run in a prison setting with guys that are in, it's a medium security, mild and medium, or low and medium security prison setting. So these are guys, some of them in for, you know, years and years and years because of violent offenses and things like this. And these are guys who, every bit of fear they have, every bit of sadness they have, they just channel it all into anger, right? They just take it all there because anger feels more powerful. And they've had, you know, we've got an upbringing, we're getting away from traditional gender roles, but particularly for men, there are still these messages that anger isn't okay. It's a good, strong, masculine emotion, whereas Anxiety, sadness, not so much. So I think folks will tend to shift into a kind of angry self perspective because it's more comfortable. It feels less vulnerable. Mm-hmm. Maybe more problematic. Certainly, we get a lot less empathy and sympathy for others when we're angry than we'll tend to when we're anxious or sad, right? Anger tends to push people away. It signals, I'm dangerous, leave me alone. But it gives folks a sense of power. And so I think in some ways, I mean, that's why I wanted to work with angry folks, because I think that in some ways they didn't get the attention that they could have, because I think there's less sympathy toward people who have problems with anger than people who have problems with some other emotions.
Could anger be a way of like, hey, listen to me, pay attention to me. You know, you're not listening, you're not empathizing with me. I want your attention.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, we get angry for lots of different reasons. Anger comes up when we see injustice. Anger comes up when we don't feel like we're being heard. Anger can come up, in many situations. And, sometimes, I don't know if you've ever found yourself saying this. I have many times in my life. I've said, well, I have the right to be angry about this, right? I have the right to be angry about this. When in my groups, something I'll say, well, I have the right to drink poison too. It's just not very good for me. Mm-hmm. I think anger is a fine emotion when it comes to helping identify situations that we need to address in our lives. But the problem is it's in most cases in modern life, it's not very well equipped to address those situations, because the motivations that come with anger are aggressive by nature, right? So there was one study that I saw that looked at anger and activism, for example. And because a lot of people say, well, my anger fuels my activism. And I would suggest that if you're going to be a really successful activist, it can't just be anger. There's got to be some compassion. You've got to be converting that into something else at some point. And the study seemed to show this. This study showed that anger did motivate activism, but it only, on an ongoing basis, motivated activism that he allowed the expression of anger. So standing on street corners with signs, yelling and screaming, that was motivated. But if you're going to do activism that actually has what I would consider more beneficial effects, we've got to find a way to move from the anger to things like empathy, compassion, things like that.
Yeah, that's what I'm looking at is it seems to me that if we want a culture of empathy, the means of empathy are the end. And if we're using anger as the means, that's the end that we get. So whatever the means are is kind of like the end that we get. And if we're using, fear, we're going to get a culture of fear, the means of fear. We're going to create a culture of fear. So we need to find ways to have the means of empathy to instead of, in these political debates, or instead of using anger or fear, we have to use empathy in some way.
I think you're right, Edwin. And I think it's important that we practice it on a day-to-day basis, that we make a decision that I want to be more empathic. I want to be, more compassionate, and to cultivate those states in our mind, because we know enough about the brain and how it works. All of these things we think and we do, and all these, they're reflected by patterns of activation in the brain. Patterns of cells in the brain light up. And the way it works, the more we engage, the more those particular patterns of cells, the more lubricated those connections become. So the way I think today shapes the probability of the way I will think tomorrow, right? So if I'm engaging, if I'm fueling anger, even if I think it's in the service of some really good cause, if I'm nurturing anger in myself today, chances are I'm going to feel anger a lot more easily in the future.
Mm-hmm. You're kind of bringing it into the neural networks, right? If we're using those neural networks of fear, we're actually, and they're firing and wiring together, they're actually strengthening. Yeah. So in the same way, if we're using the neural networks of empathy, they're fusing, becoming more ingrained in our brain, and they will be what we'll be using in the future. So if you bring it into the neural science of it, maybe.
Exactly, exactly. And that's really why it's very important, I think, to be mindfully aware when these emotions like anger and fear and things like that come up in us, and to see, oh, look, this is how I'm feeling now. How can I help myself shift from this perspective of anger into the sort of perspective I want to cultivate in myself, into compassion? I mean, I can tell you why I got into compassion. I got into being interested in compassion and compassion focused therapy after I had my son. And, for years in every class that I could fit it into, most of my students will probably become parents, or at least a lot of them. I would say, if you want to be a good parent, become the person you want your child to be. Cultivate in yourself the characteristics that you would like your son or daughter to develop in themselves, because this is how children learn, right? Through observing their parents and their caretakers and through their interactions with them and these sorts of things. And then my son came along, and I became aware that I wasn't practicing what I preached terribly well. And I was expressing a lot of irritability and anger and sort of snappishness, partially because I was on 3-4 hours of sleep a night, when you've got a newborn. But I became aware there was this real cognitive dissonance. It's like, I've been saying this stuff for years, but I'm not living it very well. And at that point, I had been reading a book about the Dalai Lama called The Wisdom of Forgiveness, rather. And I thought, there's something to this Buddhism stuff. And so I basically spent about 3 years of intensive Buddhist practice. And the practices that really were most transformative for me were the compassion practices. And at some point I got to the point where I said, I can't, in my mind, ethically be a psychologist and not bring what I've learned here into my work with my patients, because I saw what a daily compassion practice could do in terms of shifting your mind. So I think it's very important. If we want to change the culture, we've got to get a lot of this threat stuff out of the way. And then we've got to create this way for people to bring empathy into their daily lives, to bring compassion into their lives day by day by day, to practice it and to prime those networks in the brain and to strengthen those connections to build those sorts of habits. I think that's how the culture changes, ultimately.
That was from that dance experience. That's kind of what I saw there too. It was really about me looking at how I deal with the fear and the anxiety, and to bring my presence. So develop a practice of continuously doing that, continuously transforming, the fears that are kind of within my own body, and transforming them with empathy and presence.
Yeah. So over time, what happens is you've built a new habit. Suddenly, when fear comes up in you, instead of running away from it, you're coming towards it.
Yeah.
And seeking to understand it. And it's not so terrifying anymore. And that's that melting quality. Oh, look, fear. Okay, I know you.
Well, I did want to be sure to cover the other points that you mentioned about how to build a culture of empathy and compassion. You mentioned actively teach empathy in the schools in fun team-building ways, which you said we're already doing that in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I think there are schools. I think there are a lot of people that see that this is something that's useful, and I think the schools are already doing things like that. But just things like putting kids in situations where they're asked to think about what another person might be feeling, right? Just to have it occur to them, right? I think that we get in these lives that are so busy and sometimes threat-filled that it's not that we're not empathic because we don't want to be empathic. It just doesn't occur to us. We're just too busy marching through the day. And so to create the impetus for this sense that considering how other people are feeling is something worth prioritizing. Mm-hmm. And once you get someone doing that, I think it becomes self-perpetuating because it works. We get along a lot better with other people if we think about how they're feeling and how our actions impact them.
Yeah, I feel like we need like an empathy curriculum, from earliest grade through, high school, that it's actually kind of built in, and, with conflict resolution, empathic listening, the arts, and so.
I would love to see that.
So it's very conscious. Well,
and I think that what you're saying is really important. And I think one of the other things that's going to have to happen is a shift in the way we think about evaluating the effectiveness of our schools. I know I live in Washington State, and so up until fairly recently, we had something called the WASL, which is the Washington Assessment of Student Learning. I think it's what it's called. And I talked to a lot of educators. I talked to a lot of people in the system, from principal level on down to teachers and kids. And what seemed to happen is that this emphasis on testing and your scores have to be high enough, and there's funding decisions linked to that, created a sense of stress throughout the system. And so the administrators are stressed because their funding depends on student performance. And so they pass that threatened sense on to the teachers, who then pass it down to the students. And there's this tightening that comes up around that. And so how do you put in a curriculum of empathy into a system that's in a state of threat over these other outcomes, right? And so I think the methods that we do these other things have to mirror the emphasis on empathy and compassion as well. Okay, we need to evaluate the schools to make sure they're effective, but how can we do this in a way that doesn't terrify everybody involved or create this, this feeling of threat? And so we can create space for empathy, curricula, and things like this. So I think we need to approach things in slightly different ways so those can be possible.
Yeah, it's like all the testing that happens is everybody's scared. Oh, I'm not going to do well on the test. My whole life is going to fall apart. I'm not going to have a good life because my test scores aren't high, and so there's a whole set of underlying values under that. And it's like, what I'm looking at is how to, bring empathy and consciously say we need a culture of empathy and compassion, and we need to restructure society so that it nurtures those values. And the education, I think, maybe the evaluation is how well are we doing on empathy? It's like, what's our level of empathy? We need to do more work on creating more empathy.
It would be nice. And, you could, I think I would be interested in really implicit measures of, if empathy is going up in a school, right, we would expect the frequency of bullying incidents to go down, right? Those are the outcomes. I'm interested in measuring empathy in all sorts of ways, but I'm real interested in things like bullying, right? Can we reduce the frequency of victimization? Well, I think if we've got a school that shapes empathy, probably you would, because one of the things that supports the bullying are silent bystanders, right? They see it happening, but it's like, well, boy, if I say anything, then maybe he'll bully me, and so I'm just keep quiet. But what if we had enhanced the empathy so people see someone being bullied and they just get this strong feeling of, oh gosh, that would feel terrible. Look at how terrible it is for that person. Maybe they might take some compassionate action to stop it. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the things for me that would help with that, like if you're a bystander, you kind of go by, well, what are the rules of the society? And when we see the politicians, using fear, for personal gain, it kind of creates that culture. So then we know that the cultural value is not necessarily empathy. And so, that bullying for me is kind of like mirroring what's going on at the broader societal level. So that if we have the value of empathy explicit within the culture and say, we explicitly value empathy, and if you're a bystander, that you can call emotionally, and morally on that cultural value and say, no, we have a cultural value that says empathy is important, and this is not an empathic situation here with this bullying that's going on. And then, have ways of empathizing with the bully and the bullied, for example.
Yeah, because happy, healthy people don't bully either, huh?
Yeah, there's some need there for that that's going on. So
I think you make an important point. We have to lead from the top.
Yeah.
I think the model's at the top. How do you tell a kid that attacking others isn't a way to get your needs met? when they turn on the TV and the people, who are the well-respected, successful people in the culture are doing their best to attack other people, right? How do you convince a kid that that's not how to be successful when the models of success that they have seem to be doing that all the time? And it's very difficult. I think you're absolutely right about that, Edwin.
Yeah, so you're saying it's like the politicians, the corporate heads, the teachers. How do we bring empathy, to be modeled by them? And how do we, I guess that would mean is the society would need to be structured so it's that people who are the most empathic are the ones that are promoted throughout the social hierarchies.
Well, but there will always be, I think, a difficulty for that happening. I think that's never going to completely happen, I think. And the reason is that ambition, I mean, again, here's those, we talk in compassion-focused therapy, we talk about those three circles, right? The threat system, the kind of drive, ambitious system, and then this third set of emotions that has to do with connectedness and feeling safe and comfortable. Well, a lot of empathy, I think, comes from being able to inhabit that feeling of being safe and comfortable and feeling connected with other people. That's not the most ambitious place to be, right? So your people that are really empathic might also be your people that aren't the people who are going to crawl and scramble and work, tireless hours to reach their way to the top. Because maybe their definition of success doesn't have to do with prestige or with those sorts of things. Maybe they're more content with having a reasonable job that supports their ability to have really good relationships with friends and families and things like this. So I think it's hard to just promote. I don't necessarily see a world where the most empathic people are the ones who make it to the top, because they might not be the people that are working as hard for those external goals. They might not be the most ambitious, or if they are, their ambitions are maybe directed towards strengthening their communities or having really good relationships with their kids and their families. So I think there's a push-pull there. It would be very nice, but I don't know if it's realistic to think about that. I think
you sound like a little skeptical about it, that it's going to be the people who are the most self-centered and driven in that sense are going to be the ones that kind of push their way to the top.
Well, I think there's a flavor of that, but I think it's important to recognize that we all have an ambitious quality towards us that wants to achieve and wants to be recognized and wants to be a success in these various life domains. And we all have the capacity for empathy and compassion. So even if we're someone who tends to be really ambitious, I think probably your most empathic people will probably be less ambitious than your most ambitious people. Mm-hmm. But I think we can change the culture in a way so that really ambitious, high succeeding people also are compassionate, empathic people. Because, a lot of what we do in terms of succeeding involves relating and interacting with other people. And so empathy, if you're able to be empathic, I think gives you a real leg up in terms of governing, in terms of handling human resources, because you can understand what's going on with the people that you're governing or the people that you're supervising or things like this. So I'm not so cynical as to say, oh, it's those terrible ambitious people who make it to the top, and the nice empathic people are very content, in the middle. Because I think that's a fiction to say there are the terrible ambitious people and there are the nice. We've all got these different sort of capacities within us, and it's which ones do we choose to develop. And I think hopefully we can structure the culture so everyone hopefully values empathy and compassion a bit more. That would be my kind of vision of what I'd like to see happen.
Well, okay. Well, we've gone for about an hour and 15 minutes. Usually I go for an hour, but I just really enjoyed. I enjoy the conversation. So I hope I didn't go over your schedule or anything.
No.
Okay. No. So yeah, is there any thing that you feel we should cover that wasn't covered? That's kind of like a burning thought, or?
Well, the only thing I would say, presumably someone's going to watch this, and hopefully it's someone who's interested in empathy and compassion and things like this. And what I'd like to say is that we can bring this quality of empathy and compassion into every every moment of the day, right? We can, if we just allow ourselves to be aware of it, find ourselves a way to remind ourselves of it, we can bring this, even if we're doing dishes, right? We can work with our motivation. A lot of times we go through the day, just, I'm going to check off items on my list. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do the interview. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do this. But, you know, we can change the reasons why we're doing it. So if I'm washing dishes, I can wash dishes because I've agreed with my wife that I'm going to wash dishes tonight. Or I can wash dishes because I want my family. I love my family and I want them to be able to eat meals without contracting diseases. So I want to clean those dishes really well so they're healthy. You know, if I'm working at a restaurant, I can be working for $10 an hour and saying, well, I'm slaving for 10 or working for $10 an hour, or I can be doing it because I want to feed people. So we can bring this quality of compassionate intention into every moment of our lives. When we're interacting with another person, we can remind ourselves to check in and think, what is this other person feeling? What are they thinking? And the more we do that, the more we strengthen those neurological patterns associated with doing it. And eventually we start doing it more automatically. And eventually it just starts arising in our lives. And this is how we change. And I think that's really important. It's easy to put this stuff off because it feels so huge, you know. But the way we change is that one small moment at a time. And I think it's really important to recognize that.
Yeah, so in every action that we're doing, in every relationship, we're looking for the way that it supports connection and compassion and empathy.
Yeah, and the real secret in all that is, at least in my experience and the experience I've talked to, the greater the extent to which we do that, the happier our lives. The happier our lives become, the better our relationships become, the better our marriages become, the more respected we are by our colleagues, because we're forming and maintaining connections that support us and support other people. So, you know, I think it becomes self-perpetuating after a while, but it's also work, right? Sometimes it's easier just to sort of check out and go on autopilot, but it doesn't work quite as well.
Well, it's an ongoing process, like you say, and I hope we can, you know, part of my way of doing that is to engage in these dialogues and, you know, create a dialogue around this, how we can do this and keep the dialogue going. So I hope we can, you know, maintain a connection and, you know, maybe have some other dialogues, some panel discussions or, you know, other kind of ways like that to, you know, keep this going and really work it. I'm kind of looking at working to foster a movement too, you know, a very conscious movement to foster these values. So I hope we can do that in the future too.
You know, I am game. Okay. Anytime you want to do something like that, count me in.
Okay, great.
We'll find a way to make it work.
I got a commitment out of you.
You do.
Empathic commitment. Yeah, good. Okay, Russell, it was a real pleasure to talk with you, and I will get back to you on that for the next steps, and we'll set up a panel. So, okay.
Sounds good. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
See the world through other people's eyes. Now, empathy is a quality of character that can change the world.